Welcome into press coverage. I'm Dan Hope, joined by Andy Anders, as Ohio State football suffered some very unfortunate news on Tuesday night as Seth McLaughlin suffered an Achilles injury in practice and is expected to miss the remainder of the season. And this is now the second time that we are sitting here talking about a major injury to Ohio State's offensive line this season, because the Buckeyes already lost one of their best offensive linemen in the sixth game of the year when Josh Simmons went down with a season-ending knee injury. And now, going into another big game for the Buckeyes, they are going to have to replace their starting center, Seth McLaughlin, who many people had viewed as one of the best centers in all of college football this season.
Yeah, not just one of the best centers in college football, but look, if you sat there and asked me, before this news came out, who are the three players Ohio State could least afford to lose at this point in the season, I'd tell you Will Howard, Caleb Downs, and Seth McLaughlin. And it's not as much of he's the glue that holds Ohio State's offensive line together, is what I'm trying to get at. That's what the role he's filled all season. Not just doing all those center responsibilities, making the calls, but he's been a huge leader for that unit. He sets the middle of it very well, the way they communicate, the way they block off of each other. Ryan Day's called him a pro in the past, and it is like having that extra, just a really good field sense on the field and a really good experienced hand at that center position. It had been such a valuable asset for Ohio State, and we'll get into options to replace him, but they're going to miss that in this offensive line moving forward. And now you're down, arguably, I'd say, given how they played this year, their two best offensive linemen in Josh Simmons and Seth McLaughlin. Donovan Jackson has had really good moments and has done a great job sliding out to fill that left tackle job and come along in that role. But if you were to ask me who are the two best Ohio State offensive linemen this year based on their play, it would have been Josh Simmons and then Seth McLaughlin. And now both of them are gone from this offensive line, and it's just a unit that almost feels snake bitten at this point.
When you think about the transformation this offensive line had made from last year, when it was the team's clearest weakness last year, to being a strength at times for this team this season, I think really the number one thing people pointed to was Seth McLaughlin, that stabilizing presence that he had on the offensive line this year at that veteran center, and just how consistent he was at that position. So to take him away, it's certainly a massive loss for this Ohio State football team. Now, as we think ahead to what's next for this offensive line, I do feel somewhat better about the state of the interior offensive line having to replace someone than I did with having to replace Josh Simmons, at least initially. Now, the problem is you've already lost one guy on that interior offensive line by virtue of sliding Donovan Jackson out to left tackle. Carson Hinzman has stepped in there and performed very well at left guard. But now you face the possibility of having to move him back to center. Now, the good news is Carson Hinzman started 12 games at center last season. Had his ups and downs, but now has another year of experience under his belt, has played very well in his 3 starts so far at left guard. So I think you feel like if you have to move Carson Hinzman back over to center, that feels like a solid option. If you do that, I would think that most likely Austin Siereveld, who we thought might be the guy to step in when they initially moved Donovan Jackson over to left tackle, you would think he's probably the next man up at left guard because he started the first 2 games of the year there. He's played a good amount as, that kind of 6th man off the bench on the offensive line this year. So you figure that's the most likely option. I think there's 2 other possible options. You could slide Josh Padilla in there and make him the starting center. When Ryan Day was asked a couple weeks ago kind of who the backup center was, now that Carson Hinzman had made that move over to left guard, he said they were still determining whether that would continue to be Carson Hinzman or if it would be Joshua Padilla. Now, granted, that wasn't at the time, Ryan Day wasn't thinking he was going to have to replace Seth McLaughlin for the remainder of a season. So it's a different calculation. But, I did very small sample size, but I did notice just rewatching the game the other day against Northwestern that Josh was mauling some dudes on that last drive. There was one play that it was he was moving his man like 10 yards down the field. So again, really small sample size. How much can you take away from a play on the second to last play of a game against Northwestern and translate it to now playing in some of the biggest games of the season? But I do think that he's made some strides this year to where they'd have some confidence in his ability to step in if they decide to go that route. And then the other option would be Luke Montgomery, who's kind of, faded a little bit this year, but was someone who came into the year we thought he could potentially be that guy at right guard. He kind of faded in that competition, but he's still somebody that has a lot of upside, who has been the second team left guard for most of the year. And so if they have to move Carson Hinzman over to center, you would think Luke Montgomery could then also be an option at left guard. So really 3 second-year offensive linemen there. You're looking for one of those guys is now going to need to step up as that next man up on the offensive line.
Yeah, Luke played some center in preseason camp, but it seems like he's mostly stuck at guard since then as the season has kind of progressed here. My concern isn't Carson, wherever he plugs in. I think sliding back to center because he was working at it a lot this season, if that's the route to go, then I think you have some confidence seeing what he's done at left guard, even though you have that added component of snapping, of setting the protections, of being the centerpiece of everything. But I think you feel decent about Carson Hinzman, at least in that role. My worry is about the next guy, because I look at what Austin Siereveld did the first few games of the season, and it was good. And then after Ohio State got into conference play, he struggled a lot more, and it's why he's kind of not been rotating as much as he did previously with Tagovailoa, I think. He hasn't maintained that same momentum that he had at the start of the year, and the rest of the guys are even more unproven when you talk about it being a Josh Padilla potentially directly filling in for Seth McLaughlin, or Luke Montgomery, who, like you said, faded in the competition, thought was going to be in the thick of it to start at right guard in the springtime. Still thought he was in the competition at the beginning of preseason camp, and he really faded from that contest. And so no one from that next group. You've seen Siereveld play well in spots, but also, again, he's just had some struggles in some areas. And so I do have concern about who that next guy is on the interior, whether it's ultimately a direct replacement at center or someone to take Hinzman's place at left guard if he moves over.
And the unfortunate thing for Ohio State now is you no longer have time to experiment. Now you're in the point of a season. You're playing an Indiana defense this week that leads the conference in sacks and tackles for loss. And so whoever that new guy is, he's going to be immediately put to the test. And oh, by the way, next week, you're going to be inside going against Mason Graham and Kenneth Grant of Michigan. And so whoever they end up deciding to go with there on that interior offensive line, they're going to get immediately thrown into the fire. And frankly, how well this second reshuffle offense of the offensive line, much like we talked about the first time, it felt like, okay, they needed a couple weeks to work through it. They figured it out, and it seemed like they were back on a good trajectory. But now they've got to do it all over again. And once again, whether this second reshuffle of the offensive line is good enough could make or break whether this Ohio State team is able to achieve its goals down the stretch.
Yeah, Dan, I, of all people, don't undervalue offensive line play. I'd argue it's the second most important position group to get right in football after quarterback. That's debatable, but it's been a credit to Justin Frye's ability to develop, and for a guy that was on the hot seat maybe coming into this season, how the offensive line responded to criticism earlier in the year. They get knocked down by the Simmons injury. They struggle for a week. They respond again, and now it's that feeling of being snake bitten almost. But to your point about not having multiple weeks to get this right like they did after the Simmons injury when you played Nebraska before, and you had a bye week and played Nebraska before you played Penn State, this happened. This happens right in the midst of your biggest stretch of the year, and it happens on a Tuesday in the middle of practice where you don't even get a full week to prepare the next guy. Maybe you probably got to get some reps after McLaughlin went down. Obviously don't know when exactly it occurred in the practice, but you got a Wednesday full go practice. You got there's not a lot of time even just during this week to even establish who is the best option there, and test different combinations out. You kind of got to go with your gut, pick a line, and just run with it Wednesday, and get them as much confidence, experience, looks as you can in that limited practice window, because this Indiana defensive line is ferocious. That's coming to the shoe on Saturday. 31 sacks, 73 tackles for loss, both lead the Big Ten. You just really feel for this offensive line that, again, it just almost feels snake bitten at this point to keep having these season-ending injuries happen.
Well, we'll certainly be continuing to follow this story the rest of the week as Ohio State prepares for its top 5 showdown with Indiana on Saturday. Ryan Day set to meet with the media on Wednesday evening, so we'll see if we get any more answers on what the offensive line might look like then. But certainly now the biggest challenge that Ohio State is going to have to deal with this week as it prepares for a really good Indiana team, a must-win game in terms of Ohio State's Big Ten championship game aspirations. And Ohio State will have to do it with a new starting center. And so stay tuned with 11 Warriors for much more coverage on this story and on Ohio State versus Indiana. And we'll catch you again on the next episode of Press Coverage.